Thank you guys so much for coming. This is our first ever event for psychology students for social responsibility. So we're really excited to have you all and our esteemed speaker, Dr. Stephen Reisner, here. Psy SR is a new student group within our doctoral program community with the aim of promoting social justice, sustainability, and human rights through our psychological knowledge and expertise. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Stephen Reisner, PhD, is President-elect of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. He is an international consultant on trauma and its treatment and an activist in the effort to stop torture. He is on the faculty at the Institute for Psychoanalytic Education at NYU. Dr. Reisner has been a consultant on torture, trauma, and resilience worldwide, including recently in Haiti, where he trained the United Nations leadership in addressing the trauma of UN staff at the International Criminal Court in The Hague and in various countries in Africa. On September 11, 2001, he helped create the Family Resource Center at St. Vincent's Hospital in downtown Manhattan. Dr. Reisner is a founding member of the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology, a group dedicated to upholding international standards of human rights in psychological practice and research, and supporting psychologists who work to combat the effects of political violence and oppression internationally. He is also advisor on psychological ethics for Physicians for Human Rights. He's worked with both groups to change the APA's policy on supporting psychologist participation in coercive and abusive military intelligence interrogations at places such as Guantanamo Bay, Bagram, and the infamous CIA black sites. He has appeared frequently on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman and was profiled in Newsweek magazine for his work to stop health professionals' complicity in government-sponsored torture. Because of his work, Dr. Reisner was the recipient of the New York State Psychological Association's Beacon Award, which is presented to a psychologist whose leadership or advocacy has established a guiding light for the profession. In an earlier career, Dr. Reisner was an Obie Award-winning theater director and actor, whose projects have been performed at the Public Theater, La Mama ETC, which is experimental theater, and for the New City in New York, and on tour in North and South America. By day, Dr. Reisner is a practicing psychoanalyst and a couples therapist in New York City. So with that, I'd just like to sort of segue by saying that I think as clinical psychology doctoral students, we often wonder about and oftentimes fail altogether to see the connection between psychology and activism. So I'm going to turn the floor over to our speaker, who will shed some light on how we can bridge the gap.
That's kind of a perfect segue, because for me, what has happened to clinical psychology in the past, 25 years since I've been conscious and active as a clinical psychologist, what's happened is that what I would say was the integral role of activism as a part of the definition of what it means to be a psychologist, has kind of been separated out. And it appears now to become a choice of what kind of psychologist, what kind of therapist we are, and who we're working with. And that is a change. For you, who don't have that, some of you do have the perspective, but for the students here who don't have that perspective, I would like to restore for you an idea of the intimacy, of the inseparability between psychology as a practice that is radical and psychology as a practice. Let's start with, I'm going to start with the beginning of psychology, or at least what I consider the beginning of psychology, which of course has to do with Sigmund Freud. Freud started out his treatment believing that people had been terribly traumatized and they needed to remember the trauma, and then they would not have those terrible symptoms any longer. So there was a kind of an idea that people start out in this normal life, and something terrible happens that's an exception. And the role of the therapist is to restore the normal state of being, the normal role in society, the normal way of behavior. And this was not only Freud's idea, it was Janet's idea, it was Breuer's idea, it was Charcot's idea, it was the kind of the popular idea of psychological treatment at the turn of the previous century. And then Freud made a couple of very interesting discoveries. Since I have an hour, I'm going to get to how that leads to activism and being a psychologist today. Freud made a very interesting discovery. He was a neurologist, and some of the symptoms he was seeing were called glove hysteria. There was a paralysis of the hand in many middle-class housewives in Vienna. And Janet's theory and Charcot's theory and Breuer's theory that there was a kind of genetic deterioration that caused physiological debilitation without real physical problems in these patients. In other words, they imitated real physical problems. So they imitated seizures or they imitated paralyses. Freud said that couldn't be. It couldn't be simply a faux physical problem because he was a neurologist and he knew that you couldn't physiologically have a paralysis of the hand and not have paralysis of the nerves and the body. So what Freud realized was that these patients had a conception of anatomy that trumped the reality of anatomy, and that the psychological meaning of experience and symptoms was as important, if not more important, than the physical attributes, and that the meaning we make of things is key. And so Freud's treatment, unlike Breuer's treatment, unlike Charcot's treatment, unlike Janet's treatment, Freud's treatment was to free the patient to understand the meanings that they have put to their experience. For Freud, and as far as I'm concerned, for psychologists, our role, among other things, is to increase freedom. The freedom of the personality, the freedom of the individual to cope with the things that happen. It's not what happened to you. It's what you make of what happened to you. Now that, to me, is a rather radical and liberating practice of what our field is for. But something rather huge shifted in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of what we're taught and how we're expected to be psychologists and therapists in this country. We no longer focus on what people make of their experiences and how symptoms reflect what they make of their experiences. We look at symptoms as deviations from the norm, and we prioritize the norm. So if somebody comes to us these days anxious because they're working 14-hour days and they're not making enough money and their family is upset and their kids are watching too much TV and getting fat, nobody's overseeing them, we're taught to help them with stress reduction. Now, in that circumstance, stress reduction is our collusion in a depoliticization of human experience. I'm going to say that again. In that circumstance, our working to reduce their stress is our collaborating in a depoliticization of their human experience. Because we're not saying, hey, your body has got a very good sense of what is too much stress. And your soul has a very good sense that something is wrong here. And my job is to help you to articulate what's wrong so that you can become empowered to make some changes. That's what I think psychology was once about. But now, it's, there's medication for that. So, who have we started to work for? Are we working for the individual? Are we working for the insurance company? Are we working for the government? Are we working for the boss? For the most part, we end up working for the insurance company who's working for the boss. Our goal is to get rid of the symptom, send them back to the situation they were in before. Right? The symptom is the problem. In huge terms, let's take a look at our military and the concept of PTSD. We have got the most traumatized collection of veterans after these two wars than we have ever had, with the highest percentage of suicide attempts than we have ever had. And once again, the government is, first they're giving Martin Seligman's operation $31 million to train the soldiers in positive psychology. And second, they're doing an enormous amount of symptom-focused treatment. And nobody is saying that maybe what our troops are suffering from is a disastrous disillusionment of what the meaning and purpose of their service was about. And they come home and there is no support for the meaning and purpose of their service. There's no way to make something worthwhile of that experience. And instead, there are symptoms. And suicide is, to some extent, the ultimate protest. And our military is aware of that. When there were suicides at Guantanamo, they considered it warfare. They considered that the prisoners at Guantanamo that was their terrorist act to attempt suicide or to go on a hunger strike. So our government and our military has been working very hard to depoliticize our bodily experiences, our psychological experiences, our symptoms, you can call them symptoms, but our distress, our realistic, understandable, and meaningful distress. And so this language of what are we here for as therapists, as psychologists, as researchers, are we here to help people reduce symptoms and become more normal? Or are we here to help people live a rich, robust, compassionate, courageous life that is free to rethink the system that you're being handed and creatively come up with alternative solutions? Now, what's really key in all of this has to do with what our values are. Because we have a choice of looking at the norms as values that we don't think about. You know, we just want to be like others. We just want to be in the middle of the normal curve, whatever it is. And included in the normal curve has a lot to do with gender issues and GLBT issues and race issues and many, and workers issues, class issues more than any, not more than any, but equal to any. So normativity masks social injustice. I'll just be clear. The fight to create a normative society and to be suspicious of anyone whose symptoms take them away from the norm, that promotes the status quo. That is a fundamentally anti-progressive, kind of conservative, state-perpetuating form of therapy. And the other thing that it does is that it makes passive our patients. Because you've got a symptom, I'll help you get rid of it, rather than you've got a complaint. Let's figure out what to do with that energy, that other than have it go into your body in a paralysis of the hand or a panic attack. Let's find out what makes you nervous and use that energy more productively. That's one possibility. Or we can take medicine and pay the pharmaceutical companies, pay the corporations that profit handsomely by frightening people into feeling that they're abnormal and they have to get normal. And there's a big profit to be made by frightening. Now, I want to now shift this over. There's two more areas I want to shift this freedom versus normativity, conceptualization, and the values that underlie it. One has to do with government. I was raised with a kind of an ideal having to do with democracy and the role of government. For me, democracy and the role of government was to create a safe enough environment where people were free to think, free to create, free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, that the role of government was really to create an environment for safe, creative difference. Okay, and think of the analogy to therapy. The idea of a therapy office, in my view, is to create a safe space for the freedom of the individual to tap their strengths and to overcome their habitual problems that come from fear. So, democracy, therapy, there's a value system that has to do with inner freedom. Freedom, transparency, egalitarianism, opportunity. All of those values go into both. However, what's happened, I think, in our country, especially since September 11th, is that the idea of government has changed. The idea of government has changed from fostering intellectual freedom, for example, at universities, to preparing people for the job market. And the freedom that comes from low-cost education versus the anxiety that comes from debt. And so when one is indebted, one immediately has to think of what kind of job one's going to have. One has to think of one's education as preparing me for the job market. And all of the old idea of there being a separate transitional space that is academia for free thinking, free exploration, free research, that is almost gone in the last 30 years in a way that many of you are too young to even be aware of. But now, professors, are no longer tenured very often. Tenure was the idea that we believe that certain people who prove themselves to be creative and smart and leaders should be able to be free and would be interested in being free to pursue their own areas of research. Now, we've taken away tenure for the most part, and we've made professors beholden to grants in a big way coming from corporate America and military America and government. And more of those grants have got an agenda that is anything but free. If you look at the pharmaceutical company research until the scandals broke about 2 years ago, funding by pharmaceutical companies in drug research, in peer-reviewed publications, drug companies had the right to prevent the publication of any research results that were negative, that proved a negative result in terms of the drug that they were using. Think about that. And that research took place in teaching hospitals. It took place in university-affiliated hospitals. We had a system in place that undermined this very concept that free people will create a worthwhile country and a worthwhile, sustainable world. That what we want to promote is a kind of a genuine, curious freedom of intellectual exploration and of human exploration. Instead, we developed an academic system more and more, and a government system which promotes normativity. Our representatives to Congress are no longer people we think are really the best and the brightest in this field, in the field of government. They're the ones who are supposed to follow the norm. They represent the norm, and there's this whole huge, in the debates and in the campaigns, we're trying to set up the sort of lowest common denominator of opinion, make it emotional, and have them promise they're going to represent it. I remember when George Bush nominated somebody for the Supreme Court, his praise for her, his chief lawyer, legal consultant, his praise for her was that whatever she thinks today, she will think for the rest of her life. She will not change her opinion on anything. And so what I'm talking about here is a shift in a kind of government corporate value system that trickles down to the universities and trickles down to our consulting groups. And I'm trying to oppose that with remembering an alternative view. Winnicott, the great psychoanalytic theorist, spoke about the consulting room as a holding environment. His idea was that if you have a safe space where the therapist is not reactive or punitive, but supportive and smart, that the freedom that engenders itself is what you can trust. And if you add to that what I consider the important values, the values of freedom and compassion and a richness of experience and courage, I think that then we would say that our consulting rooms and hopefully again our universities and hopefully ultimately our democracies will be laboratories for progressive change and the development of social justice, of human rights, of people who are not worried about going against the norms of government or the norms of institutions. And now I want to bring this over to the title of my talk, which has to do with ethics. And what ethics are for, how they are used, and especially how the American Psychological Association's ethics code has been changed starting in about 2002, really before 2002. And I want to say that the change that I'm describing really predates September 11th. So, September 11th is one of those events in history that kind of magnified and catalyzed social changes that were already beginning before September 11th. Just like people talk about the 60s, as if it's the Woodstock and whatever was the 60s, but that was like 1969 and 1970 and 1971. You can't really use those single events to determine what's going on. There are more social forces at work. And it's fascinating to read the history of the APA Ethics Code to see how the changes began to creep in actually before September 11th. And that was really in 2000, 2001. There was a committee to change the ethics code, and it was very few ethicists on that committee, mostly psychologists, and also what shocked me in researching it, they put the CEO of the American Psychological Association's Insurance Trust on the committee to determine the ethics of psychologists. Now where are the values? Ethics should not, having the insurance trust CEO there, is saying that ethics should not contradict our self-interest. We shouldn't be liable for our ethical positions. And there were also folks from the military and visits from the CIA, so I've been told, at those committee meetings to help recast the ethics code. And I'm going to give you some idea of what was changed, because it's pretty shocking to me still. The first change is, it's infamous now, 1.02, that when there's a conflict between law and ethics. Now, what is an ethics code? An ethics code is very specifically a code of values that we adhere to independent of law. It is over and above the law. The law is there to be the law, but for a psychologist or a physician or a lawyer, even if something is legal doesn't mean it's okay. Consenting adults can have sex with each other. That's legal. Consenting adults, if one is the psychologist and one is the patient, cannot have sex with each other, because our values say that there is an imbalance of power in that circumstance, and the psychologist has got power by virtue of being the psychologist in that office, and therefore has to be very careful in abusing that power, and that's what our ethics tell us. So our ethics code is a time-honored code that says we believe in certain values over and above the law, whether or not the law agrees with it. And the old code said, if psychologists' ethical responsibilities conflict with law, psychologists make known their commitment to the ethics code and take steps to resolve the conflict of responsibility. It's simple. We make known that we have our allegiance to the ethics code. In 2002, that was changed. The change was, if psychologists' ethical responsibility conflict with law, regulations, or other governing legal authority, see the scope expand. Psychologists make known their commitment to the ethics code and take steps to resolve the conflict in a responsible manner. If the conflict is unresolvable via such means, the psychologist may adhere to the requirements of the law, regulations, or other governing legal authority. This change is simply to say that we no longer have an ethics code. We have an ethics suggestion. Because if there's a conflict, we can follow not only the law, but any regulations, university regulations, or other governing legal authority, meaning the military. So suddenly, 57 years after Nuremberg, the American Psychological Association wrote into the ethics code, I was just following orders, as a successful defense to the charge of ethics violation. What else did they change? They changed, the other thing that grew out of Nuremberg, besides it not being okay to say I was just following orders, the other thing that grew out of Nuremberg had to do with experimentation on prisoners. And that was such a scandal that physicians and psychologists and all health professionals universally put into their ethics code that they could not do research, testing, or treatment without informed consent. And that was sacrosanct, right? Informed consent. Everybody's nodding. We know, that's one of our rules. We don't break informed consent. Well, that was changed. Here, it says this is the new one, 2002. When psychologists conduct research or provide assessment, psychotherapy, or counseling with an individual in person or via electronic transmission or other forms of communication, they obtain the informed consent of that individual using language that is reasonably understandable to that person. Sounds good. Except when conducting such activities without consent is mandated or prescribed by law or government regulation or is otherwise provided in this ethics code. So you must get informed consent except when you don't. I mean, I can go on with informed consent. Now the other one, deception. That's another thing that we don't do. IRBs were created because of the scandals of deceiving people in medical research. The Tuskegee experiments, some really terrible experiments that we have done in our history, giving people syphilis, giving black people syphilis and not treating them to see what would happen, for example. And not giving them informed, and deceiving them and not letting them know right, what the real nature of the experiment was. So, dispensing with informed consent for research. Psychologists may dispense with informed consent only where permitted by law, applicable regulations, and institutional review board requirements. Okay. Now, it used to say, psychologists never deceive participants about physical pain. Now it says, psychologists never deceive prospective participants about research that is reasonably expected to cause physical pain or severe emotional distress. So it changed from, it used to be actually discomfort. The old word was you cannot deceive somebody if it was reasonably expected to cause discomfort. Now it's severe emotional distress. The interesting thing about using severe emotional distress is that that's the language that comes from the CIA's and the Office of Legal Counsel's definition of what does or does not constitute torture. And that brings me to one of the reasons why I think the ethics code changes are so important for us to learn and question. Way back in 2000, the head of the ethics committee, who was also a consultant to the FBI, well, actually, it was not in 2000. This was right in 2001, right after September 11th, December 2001. There was a conference called by the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the APA. And in that conference, they were talking about what psychologists can contribute to fighting terrorism. And Kincher, who was the director of the ethics committee at the time, said that he would recommend that all health professions, especially the APA, review their ethics code with an eye towards the needs of national security. So that was a mandate that came out of that meeting. Then these ethics code changes took place, and then the use that these changes were, to which the use to which these ethics changes were put are worth being aware of. Because I don't know how many of you are up on the relationship of the American Psychological Association and the CIA and the Department of Defense's enhanced interrogation program, otherwise known as torture. But I will, how much time have I got? I have some time. Let me give you a kind of primer. Okay, here's the introduction. I'm going to connect this piece to the question of activism. Because learning about this is how I got out of my office. I'm a psychoanalyst. I spend my days with patients. All day, every day, I spend my days with patients. And in 2002 to 2005, I was working very hard. Times were, a little bit rough, and I was working hard. I must admit I was protesting the war as best I could. I was meeting with a group of people who, we had dinner together once a month and talked about how terrible things were. But I went to the protest when we declared war in Iraq. But that was it. And otherwise, I stayed in my office. So I was a bit of an activist. And I have a history of the 60s. But really, I was staying in my office. But I was reading the newspaper. Avidly reading the newspaper. And I began reading interesting little bits. Because, our government, the CIA and the DOD, were really proud of their interrogation practices in the beginning. It was only when international human rights organizations began to read those papers and condemn them that it began to go underground. But in the beginning, they were talking about how we're taking those high-value detainees and we're roughing them up and we're doing smacky facing, but we're not doing torture. And they were speaking, that's a quote from a CIA spokesperson. And and what they were saying, we didn't know at the time, was they were saying we are keeping within the Office of Legal Counsel's determination of what the definition of torture is and is not. And then there were these hunger strikes and suicide attempts at Guantanamo. And I remember reading an interview with a psychiatrist at Guantanamo, and he was asked whether the conditions at Guantanamo were so egregious that it was causing these prisoners to go on hunger strikes or attempt suicide. And he said, no. He said, these people came with pre-existing conditions. Think of it. Think of using the language of American insurance company determinations for reimbursement to describe prisoners at Guantanamo. And then I read another article when they went to find Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of September 11th. Not a good guy. And they went to his house and they were going to arrest him, but he had escaped. But he had 2 children home, his 7- and 9-year-old son. So the CIA arrested them, put them in isolation at a CIA black site. And the article said, the CIA representative said, but don't be concerned because we have a child psychologist with you. And I began to get ethically aroused. Because what was happening here is that what I considered right and wrong was being twisted for strategic purposes. And so I began reading these things from a very different point. And then the last straw was when the International Committee of the Red Cross report on Guantanamo was leaked to the press in December 2004. And in it, they said that health professionals were supervising the interrogations tantamount to torture, quote, unquote, tantamount to torture, at Guantanamo, quote, in apparent violation of their professional ethics, unquote. And then we began trying to get all the I began to get active. Physicians for Human Rights began to get active, and we tried to make it clear, have the professional associations tell their members that it is unethical to participate in interrogations, period, and then we can stop at least that part. So the American Psychiatric Association condemned it. The American Medical Association condemned it. The nurses condemned it. The World Medical Association condemned it. No physician, no psychiatrist, no nurse can participate in any activity that is not exclusively to promote the health of anybody they come in contact with. The American Psychological Association, on the other hand, created a task force, which I would call the infamous PENS task force, PENS Psychological Ethics and National Security. And this task force said that it is our ethical responsibility to help our nation prevent terrorism, to gather intelligence, to protect people, and be part of these interrogation processes. It is our duty to be part of those interrogation processes. They took a very different position. A little research. Well, so this is when I protested. And then when they did that, and the military said, okay, we're not going to use psychiatrists, we're not going to use physicians, we're not going to use nurses, we're only going to use psychology in this way. Then I wrote a letter to the president of the APA. And I said, in my utter naivete, I said, you must not be aware that psychologists are being perceived as the only health professional association willing to participate in torture. And maybe you can make a statement to the military saying, no, we stand with the ethics of everybody else. And he wrote back a letter saying, don't believe everything you read in the press. This is not going on. There are no abuses, and we want to support our nation's fight against torture. And I posted this on a psychoanalytic listserv. One of the members of whom, I posted my letter and his letter. One of the members of that listserv was friends with Amy Goodman. Amy Goodman has a cable TV show called Democracy Now!, which is nationwide and deals in progressive issues. And she invited me and President Kuchar to debate this issue on TV. And suddenly I got out of my office, and I was on television. arguing. I didn't think I did such a great job, but I started getting calls from reporters. And I started to like hone my message, and I started getting support from various people in the human rights field who called me and began to train me. And eventually, we proposed a piece of policy, an APA policy to prevent this. And how much time have I got? I'm good. Okay. So we proposed a policy to prevent psychologists from being part of these interrogations. Now, I didn't know just how endemic to the APA leadership this position was. I still thought they just didn't realize what was going on. When I say I was naive, boy, was I naive. So they twisted it a little bit, and the language of the anti-torture policy made it comport with what they did was very simply, they said, we don't follow the UN Convention Against Torture, we follow the American reservations to the UN Convention Against Torture. I will explain why that is important. But then there was going to be a vote, and President Kuchar invited the Surgeon General of the Army, the boss of these interrogators, to speak to the Council of Representatives during the discussion of the vote, and have nobody take the other side. And I said, you know, you've got to have somebody take another side. And I recommended some very high-powered people. I didn't hear anything back. I waited about 48 hours, and I wrote a second one, because I had learned by this time how to be an activist. And I said, you know, I haven't heard from you. But I just want to let you know that colleagues of mine are encouraging me to release my letter to the press. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond before I do so. Within half an hour, I got a response. Inviting me to debate the Surgeon General, which I kind of had an idea that that's what was going to happen. So I went to New Orleans, and I debated the Surgeon General of the Army. And while I was there, I ran into this incredible woman named Jean Maria Arrigo. Jean Maria Arrigo is an oral historian of interrogation and national security. And she had been on the Penn's task force. And we didn't know who was on the Penn's task force because the membership was secret. It's the only task force in the history of the APA to keep its membership secret. And while I had been debating with the Surgeon General of the Army, one of the psychologists that was present in military fatigues came and said hello. He introduced me to her as Deborah Donovan, the wife of, what's his name? The former head, skipping my mind, it'll come to me in a minute. The former head of the practice group, who was a lawyer.
Norman Anderson? Norman Anderson?
No, Norman Anderson was the CEO. Russ Newman. Russ Newman, who was the former head, at that time, the head of the practice group, a lawyer and a psychologist. And he said, you know, she's a biscuit psychologist at Guantanamo. Actually, I'm changing the story a little bit. He had said that to a colleague. He didn't say that to me, but it was all within this circle. Anyway, so I met Jean Maria Arrigo. She was at the Penn's task force. We were talking at a psychologist of social responsibility meeting. And she said, you know, I have to keep the names of the people secret, and I have all these papers and documents that I've kept as an oral historian from that meeting. But we all agreed that we're going to keep it confidential for 10 years. No, they wanted it permanently confidential. I agreed to keep it confidential for 10 years. And I said, and in the course of the conversation, I said, you know that Deborah Donovan, who is married to Russ Newman, and I've heard that she is a biscuit psychologist at Guantanamo. We've since validated. But at that time, I could only say I heard, because I heard it, indirectly from the Surgeon General. Yeah.
Can you just explain quickly what that is for
during the enhanced interrogations at Guantanamo. These are the psychologists who were there directing how much isolation, when to hurl them into a wall, when to put them in a stress position, when to humiliate. That's who the Biscuits were. The Biscuits were following the standard operating procedures that included all of those things. And they wrote, one Biscuit, John Lesson, co-wrote the standard psychology. So Jean Maria said Russ Newman was married to Deborah Donovan. Russ Newman directed, without anybody being allowed to say it, the Penn's task force. She said, I don't any longer feel confined by the confidentiality agreement I made, because it was made under false pretenses. I'm going to share with you, which she did. And suddenly we learned the background, what happened at the meeting and who the members were. The members of that committee included Larry James, who was the supervisor of the Biscuits at Guantanamo. Biscuit number one, Larry James. Morgan Banks, who was Larry James's supervisor, who trained the interrogators at Guantanamo, or organized the training for them at Fort Guantanamo. I could go on. Scott Shumate, who was present at the CIA black site when Zubaida was being tortured. That's 3. 4. I mean, there were 6 military people out of 9 members of that task force who were directly involved in either interrogation practice or research. And I mean national security interrogation practice and research, Guantanamo and CIA interrogation practice and research. And they created the APA ethics policy on interrogation. So, now why was having psychologists so important? Having psychologists was important because the Office of Legal Counsel, the Bush administration's law advisors, the ones who make the final interpretation of the law, determined that torture is only defined as torture if under very, very restricted conditions. The restricted conditions have to do with the reservations to the UN Convention Against Torture. Not the UN Convention, which is clear, the reservations, which is what our APA policy was all about. The reservations say that you define torture not according to the UN Convention Against Torture, but according to the U.S. Constitution, prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So John Hughes said, if it's not punishment, it's not torture. If the aim is not to punish or to hurt, it's not torture. How do you prove that the aim is not to punish or to hurt? You have a physician and a psychologist present to prove that the pain and duress and distress is not going to be severe or lasting. So the role of the physician and the psychologist was written into what made torture acceptable to the U.S. government under the law. There had to be psychologists and or physicians present. If there weren't, the torture would stop. So it became so important to us to get the doctors out of there. Because if you get the doctors out of there, you cannot legally do the torture. You can illegally do it, but you can't legally do it. So these little curiosities, this small activism, became a huge issue. When I ran for president of the United States, of the APA, I just got excited. A very high-ranking member of the U.S. military approached me and said, this is after I lost, he said, you know, we in the Department of Defense were worried that you might win. Because I was working very hard to oppose So what I'm saying is you never know where small activism can lead. Two, now I can say friends of mine, Jamil and Jamil Jafar and Amrit Singh, two lawyers at the American Civil Liberties Union. I think they were either starting out lawyers or they were interns at the time. This is in 2002. They said, how do we stop the torture when we don't know what's going on? Why don't we request the documents of torture under the Freedom of Information Act? And their senior ACLU colleagues thought that that was the most ridiculous thing in the world. In fact, one of them said, you know, this is classifying, this is government, they'll never give up anything. I'll give you $1 for every page you give. Well, everything we know about the torture program, over 100,000 pages, were released because of the work of those two new lawyers working day and night to extract that information under the Freedom of Information Act. Doing something that they just sort of thought of off the top of their heads that everybody said was good. What am I saying? I'm saying that if you hold on to your values, and this is hard in this environment, this economic environment, this academic environment, and this professional environment, has all collaborated, conspired to make it very hard for us psychologists to hold on to the values that created psychology. And what psychology is, as far as I'm concerned, getting back to Freud and glove hysteria, is the question of what meaning we make of our experience and how we as therapists and psychologists and researchers can expand the possibility of meaning and value, worth and progress and creativity and decency that we can make from our bad experiences. What we learn from, what we take with us, and what we value. Psychology cannot be a value-free operation, because a value-free operation simply promotes the aims and intentions of the government and the institutions as they exist. Value-free is a code word for their values. We have to always remember what we value, what kind of an environment we want to create in our offices, in our laboratories, in our journals, in our country, in our military. I want those soldiers to know why they are at war. I want us all to take responsibility and know what values we are fighting for, so anybody who fights on my behalf can come back and we can talk about what they did and what we're going to make of it, and did we live up to the sacrifice that we asked of that person. That will undo PTSD. That will create a society that includes, I believe, human rights, social justice, sustainability. These are values that we have to simply adhere to and notice when it's taken away.
Cool. I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I'm totally with everything you say. I love your stuff. I love all of this stuff. But I've been following this PANS report for a couple of years, and I've seen some of your letters as well go through the chains of this, that, and the other thing. So I'm just curious what you directly have to say, and it's not because this is what I think, to the people who are saying that the whole reason psychologists are there is because if they weren't there, the torture would be worse, or that they're keeping they are there to try and minimize this sort of thing that they're doing down there, and so their work is good, and they really believe in what they're doing to minimize the harm against these prisoners.
I have a lot of answers that I've usually given to that question, but right now I'm thinking, there are lots of jobs in the world that are dangerous. You know, surgeons do their jobs, policemen do their jobs. Since when did psychologists get the role of standing next to all of those experts and making sure they don't lose it, making sure they don't do harm? I mean, how did that become our responsibility to be the calibrators of how to determine what they're doing? Interrogators are supposed to be trained. They're supposed to know what they're doing. And if we want to have somebody there to make sure that there's no harm being done, that's what the International Committee of the Red Cross is for. They are trained particularly about that issue. That's what, you know, the organization, the people who are supposed to make sure that nobody gets, you know, out of hand, that's not a job necessarily for psychologists. That's a job that's assessing the training of each person in their field. And so a psychologist shouldn't be the expert at what is good interrogation. So that's a start. But second, you know, this idea, it's actually absolutely prohibited in all international anti-torture protocols for there to be a doctor present certifying the readiness of a prisoner to be tortured. To say, wait a minute, stop. Okay, now you can torture a little more. That is simply completely unethical. And so to put psychologists in the position of saying, stress positions are legal. I'm going to watch this stress position and somehow determine whether it's going to cause severe and lasting harm in this prisoner is a crazy idea. It only exists, that argument only exists because the law, in order to allow torture to take place, has come up with that. The idea that psychologists can certify it, and it's not even that they can certify it. Nobody cares if a psychologist can certify it or not. The law is written to say an interrogator can mount a successful defense against a charge of torture, whether or not torture takes place, if he can say, I consulted with an expert. So the whole construction is aimed to permit torture. That's why this idea of safety officer was created by Mitchell, who was the creator of the torture protocol for the CIA, and John Yoo, who was at the Office of Legal Counsel, working together to craft the document that legalized torture. They did it together, and that's what they came up with. And he himself waterboarded Zubaydah 89 personally.